For 26 years, a killer lived freely in this quiet community, until one careless mistake exposed a truth science never forgot. Before we dive into one of Pennsylvania's most haunting cold cases, if you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries and the relentless pursuit of justice, smash that subscribe button right now. Hit that like button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single case we uncover here at Coldcase Crimelab. That is what the school principal discovered when Christy Mirack failed to show up for class on that cold December morning. Christy Mirack was a beloved 6th-grade teacher, murdered just 4 days before Christmas. What should have been a festive holiday season became one of the most haunting cold cases in Pennsylvania history. More than 60 suspects were identified. Over 1,500 interviews were conducted. Leads poured in from every corner of the community, then slowly vanished into the winter air. For 26 years, the case remained frozen in time, a mystery that would haunt investigators, family members, and an entire community. But the killer wasn't hiding in the shadows of another state. He wasn't a drifter who had moved on to another town. He lived openly in the heart of the community. A familiar, smiling face no one ever suspected. A man who walked among them every single day. A secret that would only be unraveled by a single discarded piece of chewing gum. How could someone so visible remain invisible to the law for nearly 3 decades? We're unraveling a mystery that stumped investigators for a generation. Welcome to Coldcase Crimelab. The morning of December 21, 1992, started like any other winter day in Manor Township, Pennsylvania. The small community, nestled in Lancaster County, was preparing for the Christmas holiday. Lights adorned homes, wreaths hung on doors, and children counted down the days until their winter break. Teachers like Christy Mirack were wrapping up their lesson plans before the holiday vacation, excited to spend time with their families and celebrate the season. Christy Mirack was 25 years old, full of life, and deeply loved by her students, colleagues, and everyone who knew her. She taught 6th grade at Rowerstown Elementary School, where she was known for her warmth, dedication, and infectious smile. Her students adored her. Her fellow teachers respected her. She had her whole life ahead of her, dreams to fulfill, and a loving family who cherished every moment with her. On that Monday morning, Christy should have been at school, greeting her students with her characteristic enthusiasm. But when the first bell rang and her classroom remained empty, concern began to ripple through the hallways. It wasn't like Christy to be late, let alone to miss school without calling in. The principal tried calling her home. No answer. Minutes turned into an hour. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. The principal decided to drive to Christy's apartment on Heim Road. It was a short drive from the school, and he hoped to find a simple explanation. Maybe she was sick and had overslept. Maybe her phone wasn't working. But as he pulled up to her residence, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. Christy's car was in the driveway. The apartment looked quiet, too quiet. He knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. The principal's concern deepened. He could sense that something was fundamentally wrong. He contacted the Manor Township Police Department, and officers were dispatched to the scene. When they arrived, they made entry into Christy's apartment. What they found inside would shock even the most seasoned investigators and launch one of the longest, most complex murder investigations in Pennsylvania history. Christy Mirack lay on the floor of her own home, brutally murdered. The scene was horrific. Her face was covered in blood, bruised and battered beyond recognition. The apartment showed signs of a violent struggle. Furniture was displaced. Personal items were scattered. It was immediately clear that Christy had fought for her life. She had fought hard. But her attacker had been relentless, ruthless, and determined to end her young life in the most brutal way imaginable. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation and blunt force trauma. Christy had been beaten and strangled in her own home, just days before Christmas. The brutality of the attack suggested a deeply personal rage, yet there were no signs of forced entry. This raised immediate questions. Did Christy know her attacker? Had she opened the door to someone she trusted? Or had the killer found another way inside? Investigators from the Manor Township Police Department immediately began processing the scene. This was no random burglary gone wrong. Nothing of significant value appeared to be missing. This was personal. This was murder. And whoever had done this had left behind a crime scene that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Evidence was collected meticulously. Photographs were taken. Fingerprints were lifted. And crucially, biological evidence was recovered from the scene. DNA evidence. In 1992, DNA technology was still in its relative infancy in criminal investigations. It wasn't the powerful tool it would become in later decades, but investigators knew it could be valuable. They carefully preserved the DNA samples, hoping that someday, somehow, this evidence would lead them to Christy's killer. Word of Christy's murder spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Shock and grief descended on Manor Township like a heavy fog. Parents were terrified. Teachers were devastated. Students couldn't comprehend that their beloved teacher, who had been planning their Christmas party just days before, was gone forever. Murdered in her own home. The senselessness of it all was overwhelming. Christy's family was shattered. Her parents, her siblings, her extended family, all struggled to process the unthinkable. How could this happen to Christy? She was kind, caring, and had never hurt anyone. She lived a quiet life, dedicated to her students and her loved ones. Who would want to harm her? And why? These questions haunted them day and night, demanding answers that seemed impossible to find. The investigation intensified immediately. The Manor Township Police Department, working with the Pennsylvania State Police and other law enforcement agencies, launched a massive effort to identify Christy's killer. They conducted interviews with everyone who knew Christy, everyone who lived in the area, anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual that morning. More than 1,500 interviews were conducted in the weeks, months, and years that followed. Investigators looked at every possible angle. They examined Christy's personal life, her relationships, her daily routines. They interviewed her colleagues at the school, her friends, her neighbors. They tracked down former students and their families. They looked into anyone who might have had contact with Christy in the days leading up to her murder. The list of potential suspects grew to more than 60 individuals, each one investigated thoroughly, each one eventually ruled out. Tips poured in from the community. People wanted to help. They wanted justice for Christy. Some tips seemed promising at first, leading investigators down new paths, opening new possibilities. But one by one, these leads fizzled out, leading nowhere. The investigation was exhaustive, but the killer remained elusive, hidden in plain sight. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was the lack of a clear motive. Christy wasn't involved in anything dangerous or illicit. She didn't have enemies. She wasn't entangled in any known conflicts or disputes. She was simply a young teacher living her life, dedicated to her work and her family. Why would anyone target her? What could possibly motivate such a brutal, senseless act of violence? Investigators considered the possibility of a random attack, a stranger who had somehow fixated on Christy. But the lack of forced entry suggested otherwise. They considered the possibility of someone from her past, someone with a grudge or obsession. But no such person could be identified. They considered colleagues, acquaintances, service workers who might have had access to her apartment. Every possibility was explored, every theory investigated. Yet the answer remained just out of reach. As weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, the investigation began to slow. Not because investigators stopped caring, but because they had exhausted every lead, every possibility they could identify with the tools and technology available at the time. The case became what every detective dreads, a cold case. The file remained open, the evidence carefully preserved, but active progress ground to a halt. Christy's family was left in a terrible limbo, knowing that somewhere out there, her killer walked free, living his life while Christy's had been brutally cut short. But the investigators never forgot. The Manor Township Police Department, particularly Detective Joseph Giese, remained committed to finding justice for Christy. The case file was never filed away and forgotten. It remained on desks, in minds, in hearts. Detective Giese reviewed the evidence repeatedly over the years, hoping for that one breakthrough, that one new piece of information that would crack the case wide open. Years passed. 5 years. 10 years. 15 years. The community slowly moved forward, though Christy was never forgotten. Memorial services were held. Scholarships were established in her name. Her family never stopped hoping for answers, never stopped believing that someday, somehow, justice would be served. But as the 20th anniversary of her murder approached, hope was beginning to fade. Would Christy's killer ever be caught? Would her family ever have closure? Then, in the mid-2000s, DNA technology began to advance rapidly. What had been impossible or impractical in the 1990s was becoming routine in modern investigations. Genetic genealogy was emerging as a powerful new tool in law enforcement. Investigators could now upload DNA profiles to genealogical databases, identifying not just direct matches, but distant relatives who shared genetic markers with unknown suspects. This technique had been used successfully in several high-profile cold cases, most notably the Golden State Killer case in California. Detective Giese saw the potential. The DNA evidence from Christy's murder scene had been carefully preserved for more than 2 decades. It was time to see what modern science could do with it. In 2018, 26 years after Christy's murder, Detective Giese reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy. He provided them with the DNA profile recovered from the crime scene. The question was simple but profound: could this DNA lead them to Christy's killer after all these years? If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Your support means everything as we fight to keep these cold cases alive and bring justice to forgotten victims. The team at Parabon Nanolabs went to work. They uploaded the DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogical database where people voluntarily submit their DNA information to find relatives and trace their family trees. The hope was that someone related to Christy's killer had submitted their DNA, creating a genetic breadcrumb trail that could lead investigators to their target. And that's exactly what happened. The DNA profile from the crime scene matched with several distant relatives in the database. These weren't close matches, not parents or siblings, but third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a common ancestor with the killer several generations back. But it was enough. Using these distant matches, genetic genealogists began building family trees, working backward and forward through generations, identifying common ancestors and tracing their descendants. This was painstaking work. Each branch of the family tree had to be carefully researched. Birth records, death records, marriage certificates, census data, all were meticulously examined. The genealogists were looking for male descendants who would have been the right age and in the right location in 1992. The family trees grew larger and more complex, spanning decades and multiple generations. After weeks of intensive research, the genealogists narrowed their focus to a specific family line. And within that line, they identified a man who fit the profile perfectly. His name was Raymond Charles Rowe, known to friends and family as DJ Freeze. In 1992, he would have been 25 years old, the same age as Christy. And most importantly, he had lived in the Manor Township area at the time of the murder. He was local. He had been there all along. Detective Giese received this information with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Raymond Rowe. The name meant nothing to him initially. Rowe had never been on their suspect list. He had never been interviewed in connection with Christy's murder. He had lived in the community for decades without ever drawing suspicion. How could they have missed him? As investigators began to dig into Raymond Rowe's background, a picture began to emerge. Rowe was a DJ and elementary school music teacher. That's right. While Christy had been a 6th-grade teacher, murdered in her home, her killer had gone on to become an elementary school teacher himself, working with children, trusted by parents and colleagues, living a seemingly normal, respectable life. Rowe had worked at several schools in the Lancaster County area over the years. He was known as a friendly, outgoing person. He performed as DJ Freeze at local events, weddings, school dances. He had a wife, children, a home. He attended church. He was, by all outward appearances, a pillar of the community. The idea that this man could be a brutal murderer seemed almost incomprehensible. Yet the genetic genealogy had pointed directly at him. But genetic genealogy alone wouldn't be enough to make an arrest. Investigators needed direct DNA evidence linking Raymond Rowe to Christy's murder. They needed his DNA to match the DNA from the crime scene. And to get that, they would need to obtain a sample of his DNA without tipping him off to the investigation. This is where the investigation entered its most delicate phase. Investigators began surveilling Raymond Rowe, watching his movements, waiting for an opportunity. They needed him to discard something that would contain his DNA. A coffee cup, a cigarette butt, a napkin, anything that he touched and discarded in a public place, where it would be considered abandoned property that police could legally collect. For days, they watched and waited. Rowe went about his daily routine, completely unaware that he was being monitored, that decades of detective work and cutting-edge genetic science had finally caught up with him. Then, on June 23, 2018, investigators observed Rowe at an elementary school event. He was there in his capacity as a teacher, interacting with students and parents, performing his duties just as he had for years. At some point during the event, Raymond Rowe took out a piece of chewing gum, chewed it, and then discarded it. That discarded piece of gum became the key to everything. Investigators immediately secured it as evidence. That single piece of chewing gum, carelessly tossed away, contained Raymond Rowe's DNA. It was rushed to the laboratory for analysis. The DNA analysis came back quickly. The DNA from the chewing gum was compared to the DNA from Christy's murder scene. The results were conclusive. It was a match. After 26 years, after more than 60 suspects, after more than 1,500 interviews, after countless dead ends and frustrations, they finally had their man. Raymond Charles Rowe had murdered Christy Mirack. On June 25, 2018, just 2 days after the chewing gum was collected, Raymond Rowe was arrested. The arrest shocked the community. People who had known Rowe for years, who had worked with him, who had trusted him with their children, couldn't believe it. This friendly DJ, this elementary school teacher, was a murderer? How was that possible? When confronted with the DNA evidence, Raymond Rowe initially denied everything. He claimed he didn't know Christy Mirack. He said he had never been to her apartment. He insisted there must be some mistake. But the DNA evidence was irrefutable. His DNA was at the crime scene. There was no innocent explanation for that. As the interrogation continued, Rowe's story began to change. He admitted that he might have known Christy. Maybe they had crossed paths somehow. Maybe there was some innocent reason his DNA would be in her apartment. But investigators weren't buying it. The DNA wasn't just present at the scene. It was connected to the violent assault that had ended Christy's life. Finally, after hours of questioning, Raymond Rowe's defenses crumbled. He confessed. He admitted that he had murdered Christy Mirack on December 21, 1992. The details of his confession were chilling. He described going to her apartment that morning. He described the violent attack. He described leaving her there, broken and dying, and then simply walking away, returning to his normal life as if nothing had happened. But why? Why had he done it? What possible motive could he have had for such a brutal, senseless act? Rowe's explanation was disturbing in its banality. He claimed he had become obsessed with Christy. He had seen her around the community. He knew where she lived. On that December morning, he had gone to her apartment with the intention of assaulting her. When she resisted, he had beaten and strangled her. There was no deep, complex motive. No old grudge or dramatic backstory. Just a predator who had fixated on a victim and acted on his violent impulses. For 26 years, Raymond Rowe had lived with this secret. He had attended Christy's memorial services. He had lived in the same community where her family grieved. He had worked with children, just as Christy had. He had built a life for himself while Christy's family lived with unanswered questions and unbearable pain. And he had done all of this without showing any outward signs of guilt or remorse. The arrest and confession brought a flood of emotions for everyone involved in the case. For Detective Giese and the other investigators who had worked tirelessly on the case, there was a sense of vindication and relief. They had never given up. They had preserved the evidence. And when new technology became available, they had embraced it. Their dedication had finally paid off. For Christy's family, the emotions were more complex. There was relief that the killer had finally been identified and arrested. There was satisfaction in knowing that he would face justice. But there was also overwhelming sadness that it had taken so long, that they had lived for 26 years not knowing who had stolen Christy from them. And there was anger, deep and justified anger, at Raymond Rowe for what he had done and for the decades he had stolen from them by hiding his crime. Raymond Rowe was charged with criminal homicide. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His own DNA, his own confession, his own words condemning him. There was no doubt about his guilt. The question was what punishment he would face. In October 2019, Raymond Rowe pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. By pleading guilty, he avoided a trial, sparing Christy's family the trauma of having to sit through a lengthy court proceeding. But he also avoided the possibility of the death penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, where he could never hurt anyone else. At his sentencing hearing, Christy's family members had the opportunity to address Rowe directly. They spoke about the pain he had caused, the years of suffering his actions had created. They spoke about Christy, about who she was, about the life she should have had. They spoke about the grandchildren her parents would never have, the nieces and nephews who would never know their aunt, the students who had lost a teacher who truly cared about them. Raymond Rowe sat silently, showing little emotion. He offered no real explanation for his actions, no meaningful apology. He simply accepted his sentence and was led away to begin his life imprisonment. The man who had hidden in plain sight for nearly 3 decades would spend the rest of his days in a prison cell, a fitting end to a story that had haunted a community for a generation. The Christy Mirack case represents both the frustration and the hope inherent in cold case investigations. For 26 years, despite the best efforts of dedicated investigators, the case remained unsolved. Traditional detective work, while thorough and professional, couldn't overcome the fundamental problem: the killer had never been on their radar. He had no criminal record. He had no obvious connection to Christy. He had simply committed his crime and disappeared back into the fabric of the community. But the case also demonstrates the incredible power of modern forensic technology, particularly genetic genealogy. The DNA evidence that was carefully preserved in 1992 became the key to solving the case in 2018. Without that preservation, without that foresight, Rowe might never have been caught. And without the advances in genetic genealogy, the DNA alone wouldn't have been enough to identify him. The Christy Mirack case was one of the first in Pennsylvania to be solved using genetic genealogy. It paved the way for other cold cases to be re-examined using this powerful new tool. Across the country, hundreds of cold cases have now been solved using similar techniques. Families who had waited decades for answers are finally getting them. Killers who thought they had gotten away with murder are being brought to justice. But the case also raises important questions about privacy, about the use of public genealogical databases in criminal investigations, about the balance between solving crimes and protecting individual rights. These are complex issues without easy answers. The same technology that brought justice for Christy Mirack also accesses genetic information that people shared for entirely different purposes, to find relatives and trace their family histories. Most people support the use of this technology to solve serious crimes like murder. The public databases used in these investigations are voluntary. People choose to upload their DNA information. And the technology is typically used only for serious, violent crimes, not minor offenses. But the debate continues about proper oversight, about guidelines for use, about ensuring that this powerful tool is used responsibly and ethically. For Christy's family, these broader debates are secondary to the relief and closure they finally received. After 26 years of wondering, of not knowing, of living with the terrible possibility that the killer might never be found, they finally had answers. They finally knew who had taken Christy from them. They finally saw justice served. It couldn't bring Christy back. Nothing could do that. But it was something. It was closure. It was the end of a terrible chapter that had defined their lives for more than a quarter century. The case also serves as a reminder that no case is ever truly cold as long as evidence is preserved and investigators remain committed. Technology continues to advance. New techniques continue to emerge. What seems impossible today might be routine tomorrow. Every piece of evidence carefully collected and preserved represents a future opportunity for justice. Detective Giesi's persistence exemplifies this principle. He could have let the case fade away, could have accepted that some cases simply can't be solved. Instead, he kept the case alive. He kept reviewing the evidence. He kept looking for new possibilities. And when genetic genealogy emerged as a viable technique, he was ready to embrace it. His dedication, spanning decades, made justice possible. The community of Manor Township can finally close this dark chapter of their history. For 26 years, they lived with the knowledge that a killer walked among them, unknown and unsuspected. Children attended schools, played in parks, went about their lives while Christy's murderer lived freely in their midst. That knowledge created a lingering unease, a shadow over the community's sense of safety and security. Now they know the truth. Now they know that the killer wasn't some shadowy stranger from far away. He was Raymond Rowe, a teacher, a DJ, a neighbor. Someone who appeared normal on the surface but harbored a terrible secret. His arrest and conviction removed that shadow, allowing the community to finally heal. Christy Mirack's legacy lives on in the memories of those who knew her and loved her. Her students, now adults with children of their own, still remember the kind teacher who made learning fun, who cared about them as individuals, who made them feel valued and important. Her family keeps her memory alive through photographs, stories, and the scholarship fund established in her name that helps aspiring teachers pursue their dreams, just as Christy did. The case also changed how law enforcement approaches cold cases. The success of genetic genealogy in the Christy Mirack case and others like it has led to the creation of specialized cold case units that focus specifically on using this technology to solve previously unsolvable crimes. Training programs have been developed. Partnerships have been formed between police departments and genetic genealogy companies. The infrastructure is being built to systematically address the backlog of cold cases that have accumulated over decades. This represents hope for thousands of families across the country who are still waiting for answers, still wondering who killed their loved ones, still seeking justice that has been delayed far too long. The technology exists now. The techniques have been proven. It's a matter of resources, of commitment, of going back through those old evidence rooms and seeing what can be re-examined with fresh eyes and new tools. Raymond Rowe will spend the rest of his life in prison, but his capture doesn't erase the 26 years that Christy's family waited for justice. It doesn't erase the years that Rowe spent free, living a normal life, trusted by his community, working with children. It doesn't erase the fact that Christy never got to fulfill her dreams, never got to have the family she wanted, never got to see her students grow up and succeed. But it does mean that her murder didn't go unpunished. It means that the system, despite its limitations and failures, eventually worked. It means that patience, persistence, and technology combined to achieve what once seemed impossible. It means that Raymond Rowe will never hurt anyone else, will never live another day of freedom, will never escape the consequences of what he did on that terrible December morning. The story of Christy Mirack is a tragedy, but it's also a testament to the dedication of investigators who never give up, to the power of science to reveal truth, and to the importance of hope even when answers seem impossibly distant. It reminds us that justice, while sometimes delayed, is not always denied. It shows us that evil, no matter how well hidden, can eventually be exposed and punished. As we close this case, we remember Christy not as a victim, but as the vibrant young woman she was. A dedicated teacher who loved her students. A beloved daughter and sister. A friend who brightened the lives of everyone she met. Her life was cut tragically short, but her impact continues. The students she taught carry her lessons with them. The family she loved keeps her memory alive. And the justice finally served in her name sends a message that resonates far beyond Manor Township, Pennsylvania. That message is simple but powerful: we don't forget. We don't give up. We keep searching, keep investigating, keep hoping. Because every victim deserves justice. Every family deserves answers. And every killer, no matter how long they hide, will eventually be found. The case of Christy Mirack reminds us that cold cases are not closed cases. They are simply waiting for that breakthrough, that new piece of technology, that dedicated investigator who refuses to let them fade away. They are waiting for justice. And increasingly, thanks to advances in DNA technology and the tireless work of law enforcement professionals, that justice is finally being served. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the Christy Mirack case here on Coldcase Crimelab. If this story moved you, if you believe in the importance of never giving up on justice, please subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and share this video. Leave a comment telling us what you think about genetic genealogy in solving cold cases. And remember, every share, every like, every subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories to light and keeps the pressure on to solve more cold cases. Together, we can make sure that no victim is forgotten and no killer escapes justice forever. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop seeking the truth.